Well, good morning everyone, and thank you for coming out this morning. As our presiding has said, we are really looking at this from a Bible perspective, from how World War One changed the world and impacted the fulfilment of Bible prophecy. World War One has had a profound impact on the world. Here on the screen we see the trenches and the shell holes from world wars 100 years ago. This is the battlefield of the Somme, and still we have the physical scars of that war evident today. In fact, people are still killed from unexploded ordnance from World War One in Europe today. But what we're interested in is more the social and the historical impact of World War One. You see, World War One was a war like no other war ever was before, and hopefully will be after. More than 7/8 of the world population were involved. No war was ever as extensive as this. 65 million men were mobilised in the armies that fought in this war. Compare that to the Napoleonic Wars 100 years earlier, which was one of the biggest wars the world had ever seen before. Only 2.5 million, comparatively, men were mobilised for those wars. So this was a war that pitted nations against nations. The civilian population was heavily involved in the war effort. And the death toll, over 37 million soldiers and civilians died in this war. Now here's a map of Europe before World War One started. And we can see that we have the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. They were four large empires that dominated Europe. Of course, we have the power of France and Great Britain as well. World War One caused the fall of those four empires. At the end of World War One, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. And the conflicts caused by the vacuum of those powers is something that we're still feeling the reverberations of today, especially the Ottoman Empire. This is a map of Europe just after World War One, and you'll notice that the political landscape has changed dramatically. We have the Soviet Union here instead of the Russian Empire. We have a whole lot of new countries that have been formed that didn't exist before. In fact, here we have a map just showing in purple there the new countries that emerged in the aftermath of World War One. Empires fell and ethnic groups claimed their independence. This is the Middle East before World War One, dominated by the Ottoman Empire, that had already started to decline. The Ottoman Empire had extended out to this region here as well. After World War One, a whole lot of new Middle East nations emerged in the 1930s to the 1960s, all from the aftermath of World War One. These nations filled the vacuum left by the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to see in our second talk in particular today that still has far-reaching consequences today. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was the greatest effect or the greatest consequence of World War One. It's the one that had the greatest impact on the world and still continues to have the greatest impact on the world. Unlike the other three empires, this empire had already started to decline before the beginning of World War One. In fact, it really created the spark that started World War One. So here we have a map of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was already declining here in the Balkan regions and in North Africa. And it's the Balkan regions that really take our attention today as we, in our first talk, where we're going to be focusing more on Europe. Because it was this area of the Balkans where the spark that ignited World War One began and occurred. So let's just have a snapshot of how World War I changed the world. In particular, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of nation states, and the conflict that went with that and still goes with that today. We had the fall of the Russian Empire under the Tsars and the rise of the Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. We had the fall of the German Empire under the Kaiser and the rise of the Third Reich, which started the Second World War. The Second World War was really just the sequel to the First World War. Unfinished business. Then we saw the rise of the United States as a world power, and the United States becoming involved in world events, and in particular European affairs. The United States had always had a policy of isolation. It didn't want to get involved in European alliances or European wars. But it did in 1917 in World War I, and it hasn't stopped since. We saw, as the result of World War I, a relationship between Britain and the United States that would continue to get closer and would become the special relationship that we see today. It was the coming of age of Commonwealth nations like New Zealand and Australia, the Anzacs. Not just dominions of the empire, but nations in their own right with independence and recognised as partners with the old country. We saw the decline of European power. Europe was exhausted by World War I, and Britain and the United States and Russia became greater powers, and the rivalry, the continuing rivalry between those powers, brought them into prominence as opposed to other European powers. And the greatest effect of all, from our point of view as Bible students, and also what we believe is the effect on history and the fulfilment of Bible prophecy, is the restoration of Israel as a nation in the land. While that didn't happen until after World War II, World War I paved the way for that to happen and started that process. And that, of course, has led to Middle East conflict that we still see raging today, not just between Israel and the Arabs, but throughout the Middle East generally, all because of the vacuum left by the Ottoman Empire's fall. Other things that we're not going to be really looking at today, though, is the replacement of the autocratic power with democracy and socialism in Europe. And that's a trend, by the way, that we're going to see in the Middle East as well. Whenever an empire or an autocratic power falls, all of the ethnic groups and the social groups within that were once under the control of that empire now become independent. They now want to have their own, they want their independence and their own self-determination. And that causes conflict. It causes war. The rapid advance of technology and the social changes that were caused by World War I. The role of women. Women became very involved in the war effort, and that had a big impact on the role of women in society. And the decline of Christianity. You see, the churches on both sides were part of the war effort, and they were urging their men to fight this war because God was on their side. And with the horror of World War I, a lot of people lost their faith in a God that could allow such a thing to happen. But nationalism was really one of the greatest causes of World War I. Nationalism was a force that had been unleashed about 100 years before World War I. You see, 1914, the European nations were probably preparing the commemorations of the 100 years since 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, which saw Napoleon finally defeated. And the Napoleonic Wars stemmed from the French Revolution and the fall of the feudal system. So no longer did people have a loyalty to their Lord or to their church or to whatever little power there was that they were under the control of. They now saw themselves as a nation. And so there were events like the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. You see, those countries were not just always countries in their own right. Italy and Germany, for example, were a whole conglomeration of small little states, and each of those little states had control over their citizens. But with the advent of nationalism and a national identity, those small states became united into whole countries, Italy and Germany. And of course, Germany became a great power that was to dominate Europe. And the fall of these empires, the empires of, in fact, after World War I, the fall of the Germanic Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, created national ambitions and self-determination amongst the different ethnic groups that were once formally controlled by one autocratic power. And it's a trend that we see in history throughout ages. In fact, we've just seen it recently with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union once controlled all of this territory, or had a great influence over it. In fact, it had direct control. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, all of these countries became independent. Even Ukraine, the cradle of Russian civilization, declared independence from Russia. And today we see a clash between Russia and the West in Ukraine. You see, nationalism is a powerful and potent force that creates political and conflict and wars. So with World War I, here we have the scene just before World War I with four empires, and it's this area here that is the hotbed of nationalistic ambition because of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. See, the Ottoman Empire once controlled all of this area, but Greece rebelled and obtained independence. And then all these countries here with a weakened Ottoman Empire, they rebelled against the Ottoman Empire and they forced the Ottoman Empire out, and they wanted to form their own independent countries. Now just have a look at the ethnic breakdown of the Balkans, and this has been an issue also in recent history with the fall of Yugoslavia under Marshal Tito. He was a strong power that melded these ethnic groups together, but when he was gone, all of these different groups wanted their own independence. They had their own nationalistic ambitions. And Serbia, for argument's sake, it has this great dream of a greater Serbia that encompasses much more than where the ethnic Serbs are. But just have a look at how these ethnic groups are all mixed up together. And how could you ever possibly have a solution where each ethnic group had its own independence? It can only have its own independence at the cost of someone else's independence. And that's been the reason for a lot of conflict in the Balkans. And this was the cause of World War I. The conflict that was going on here, not just the conflict that was going on here, but the ambition of other empires, which we'll see in a moment. In fact, we'll just... So all of these countries here, whenever there's a vacuum, smaller independent countries spring up. Here we have an example of the unification of Germany. These were all the different states of Germany. Nationalism prevailed here, and those independent states became one united country. Another important reason and cause for World War I was the aggressive arms race that was going on. You see, Britain was the undisputed industrial power in the late 1800s. With the unification of Germany, and of course the United States also coming out of its civil war, they became industrial competitors. And they produced steel in a greater volume than had ever been produced before. And the reason they produced so much steel was so they could create battleships. And a country, an empire, measured its strength in the number of dreadnoughts that it had, or battleships. And Britain was not prepared to let Germany become a great naval power to rival it. But you see, Britain declined. Germany and the United States eclipsed Britain as an industrial power. But there was a great arms race between all of these main powers. But it was the Eastern question, the fall or the decline of the Ottoman Empire, that was creating all of the problems. This is the furthest extent of the Ottoman Empire. They had a lot of territory in Europe, and they dominated the area of the Middle East. It was all under the control of the Ottoman Empire. In World War I, or rather prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire was declining in this area here. And these countries all wanted their own independence. We're focusing on Europe just at the moment. And we've already seen the mix of ethnic groups in the Balkans. And these powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, they were not particularly interested in the self-determination and independence of the ethnic groups. They wanted to have domination over the Balkans. So as the Ottoman Empire declined in Europe, these empires wanted to step in and replace the power vacuum. They didn't want these individual countries to have power, and hence the conflict in the Balkans. Added to that was the system of alliances that existed before World War I. It was a complex system of alliances that actually kept the peace for a long time. But it also then, like a domino effect, brought the whole of Europe to war over one single incident. In particular, we had France and Germany. Germany had invaded France a number of times, in particular in 1870 under Bismarck. France was humiliated by the Germans. And France wanted revenge. And to protect herself, France aligned herself with Russia. That meant that Germany would have to fight a war on two fronts if it attacked either of those two powers. Russia, of course, was very wary of a German power. Britain wasn't actually officially aligned as an alliance with France, but it certainly had a treaty of friendship. It also was concerned about German power, particularly the German fleet that was being built. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire were allies, along with Italy, and the Ottoman Empire joined later because of Germany's interest in developing the Ottoman Empire, because Germany wanted to have the Berlin to Baghdad railway where she could actually access the east without having to go there by sea, which was dominated by Britain. Those two alliance groups offset each other. But in the Balkans, where nations, newly emerged nations were wanting their own independence, and they were at conflict amongst themselves, they became aligned to these two power groups as well. And the conflict in Serbia in particular is what precipitated the war between all of Europe. And so in 1914, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and his wife were assassinated by a Serb nationalist. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire made a great big political issue out of it. And they made all sorts of unrealistic demands on the Serbian country. They basically were going to use this as an opportunity to take over Serbia. That didn't work. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire here attacked Serbia. That meant that the Russians attacked the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which meant that the German Empire was also at war, followed by the French and the British. And the whole of Europe got dragged into this war just like a domino effect, because of the alliances that they all had with each other and the obligations that they had. So the whole of Europe was plunged into war because of a nationalistic issue in the Balkans. So the war was fought on a number of fronts. Of course, we are aware of the German invasion of France and the trench warfare that occurred there. There was war between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was war in the Balkans. There was war on the Russian front. The Russians finally capitulated when the Bolsheviks rebelled against the Tsars. And of course we have the British moving up into Palestine and Mesopotamia, as they were known in that time. Those are the fronts that the war was fought on, and of course the Allied powers eventually prevailed. One of the great developments or effects from World War I, in fact it started before World War I, was the friendship and the relationship between Britain and the United States. See, 100 years before World War I, Britain and America, the United States, were at war. Little is known, it's not a very prominent war, but it actually occurred at the same time as the Napoleonic Wars. But ever since then, they grew closer, because they knew that they had a need for each other, and they both came from a common heritage, having been a former British Empire. So the Great Rapprochement was signed in 1895, a treaty of friendship between two former enemies. And in World War I, this grew into a much closer alliance. And then, of course, after World War II, the special relationship between these two great powers. These two powers dominate the maritime trade routes, and they're the dominant naval power in the world. In fact, really we have here the story of the two greatest empires, the British Empire, which has now been superseded by the United States, and the Russian Empire. And Europe is a lesser player in this rivalry. But the story that we want to follow today has got a lot to do with the historical rivalry between these two great empires. See, the British Empire flanks Europe to the left, and the Russian Empire flanks Europe to the east. And the British Empire was the world's first global power. It was a first world maritime power. At its height, it controlled 36 million square miles, which equates to 24% of the world's landmass. It controlled 25% of the world's population and existed in that way for 300 years. And Britain was not a great military power in terms of its armies. Yes, it would send armies into Europe and on certain occasions, but always allied with another European power. Britain's strength was in its navy, not in its army. And so therefore Britain would balance other European powers to keep itself prominent. So for example, in the war with France, it used Germany to help balance that power. In the war with Spain, it allied itself with Portugal to have a balance of power for itself. And when it was opposing Russia, it would prop up the Ottoman Empire to stop Russia from gaining access to the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Strait down here, and to block Russia over in the Central Asia. So Britain used other powers in Europe to balance itself with Russia and other dominant European powers that may arise. Russia, on the other hand, is the world's largest land empire. In fact, it's the world's largest country. It is 22.5 million square miles, which is 15 times its original size. And over a 400-year period, it expanded at an average of 55 square miles a day. That's quite a phenomenal rate of expansion. Because Russia originally was just this small little state here. And then over hundreds of years, it has expanded its territory phenomenally. And in particular, what's of interest to us is its southern expansion. We're going to be looking at that more closely in our next talk. The southern expansion of Russia. Now, Russia has always had designs on Turkey, on Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, on the Bosporus Straits and on the Dardanelles. Not just because of its strategic position with regard to a warm water port that Russia has always wanted, and its strategic position in terms of access to the Mediterranean, or its strategic position in terms of the junction between the continents of Europe and the Middle East and Africa, but also because of its heritage. Russia has inherited the heritage of the old Byzantine Empire that was once the ruler of Constantinople before the Turks overran it. And so the Byzantine throne, the very name Tsar is Caesar, and the niece of the last Byzantine Empire married the Russian emperor, the Tsar at that time. And the heritage of the Eastern Orthodox Church went to Russia, to Moscow. And so ever since then, Russia has always wanted to retake Constantinople, to avenge the defeat of the Byzantine Empire by the Muslims. And it sees itself as the guardian of the Slavic peoples, the father of the Slav nations that were under the dominion of the Ottoman Empire. These two powers, while they were rivals with each other and they flanked both sides of Europe, they both had one common interest. They did not want a European power to be strong and dominant. Their interests were not so much in Europe, but in their own empires elsewhere. But both 3 times in history, they worked together to prevent a European power being dominant. So they both fought Napoleon with France. They both fought Germany twice in World War I and World War II because they do not want a strong European power. That is a threat to both of them. In fact, today, I've missed a slide there. There we go. Here we have a strong European power today in the European Union. And the European Union is a threat to both countries, effectively. We know Britain is nominally a member of the European Union and is allied to NATO. It's probably not so much a threat today as we might see it, but it's certainly a threat to Russia. Because these countries here that were once part of the Soviet Union are now part of the European Union. And the European Union is pushing east into Russia. And Russia sees that as a threat because Russia has always wanted to have a buffer to prevent a European invasion. It's been invaded 3 times by a European power. And so today we see Russia backed into a corner. The reason we have an issue in Ukraine, the reason why Russia is so belligerent in Ukraine is because that's as far as they can go before you get into Russia itself. These are Russian-speaking populations, and Russia has pledged to defend the rights of Russian-speaking peoples. Russia has been pushed too far and will respond, we expect. The only war, though, that Russia and Britain ever fought was the Crimean War, and that was, again, to stop Russia taking over or attacking the Ottoman Empire. Otherwise, these two powers, the two greatest powers that have ever existed on the earth, while they have rivaled each other with intrigue and other political means, they have never actually ever fought a war apart from the Crimean War. Russia has always been seen as a threat by Britain to its interests in India. And here we have 2 Punch magazines in the 1880s. The Russian threat, as it was known, Russia trying to get through into Afghanistan, Here we have Russia, the Russian bear trying to get through to the Persian Gulf and the British line blocking its way. In fact, the reason we have a whole lot of fortifications in Littleton Harbour and all around Australia and the New Zealand coast is because of this perceived threat of Russia in the 1880s. So how does that relate to Bible prophecy? Well, World War I is not specifically, in terms of the European conflict, specifically predicted in World War I. But certainly all of the combatants of World War I are predicted to be grouped together in a battle that in the invasion of Israel. And here we have in Ezekiel chapter 38, the nations that are mentioned there, the ancient names of modern nations that are mentioned. And while a lot of these nations originally were located in this area here, they have those nations have moved with the great migrations that took place later after the time of Ezekiel the prophet. We're talking about 3,000 years ago here. And so there are two main groups of combatants, and they mirror the historic rivalry between Britain and Russia, or now the United States and Russia. So these are the names of the countries that are aligned with Russia. And then we have Britain, the ancient name of Britain being Tarshish, being aligned with the Arabians of the Saudi Peninsula, and also being the protector of Israel. Now we won't go into all the detail of this, but let's just have a look at part of Ezekiel chapter 38. It said, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters." Now we're familiar with Persia, that is modern day Iran. Ethiopia is Sudan as well as Ethiopia. Libya in ancient times meant the whole of North Africa, not just Libya today. And we have Gomer, which is the Gauls who are in France. The Magog is the Scythians, Germany and some Central Europe. But in particular, the name Rosh, coupled with Meshech and Tubal. And Rosh is the ancient name for Russia. In fact, if we were to read a Hebrew newspaper today, and we were to talk, and there was an article about Russia, it would use that very same word, Rosh. According to Gesenius, who was the world's foremost expert on Hebrew, he identifies the word Rosh with Russia. He says in Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 2, "Rosh is a proper name of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshech, undoubtedly the Russians." And the historian Bocart says it is credible that from Rosh and Meshech, that is the Rossi and the Moschi of whom Ezekiel speaks, descended the Russians and Muscovites, nations of the greatest celebrity in European Scythia. Ross is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name of Russia. And so Rosh, Meshech and Tubal over to the east is effectively the Russian nation of today. We won't go into detail with all of the nations because it would just take too much time, but it's a subject that we do deal with at various times. Opposed to this invading force from the north is Tarshish and Sheba and Dedan and the young lions. Now, they are the counterforce to this northern invasion. Sheba and Dedan are the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula. So who is Tarshish exactly? How do we know that Tarshish is Britain? Well, earlier on in Ezekiel, Tarshish was described as a merchant. So that's why they're called the merchants of Tarshish. And in particular, they traded with silver, iron, tin and lead. Now these were metals that were not in abundant supply in ancient times. In fact, there were only really two places where they were able to be obtained, and they were obtained by the Phoenicians. Now the Phoenicians were the maritime power of the ancient world, and they came to Cadiz in Spain to get tin, and they also went to Cornwall to get tin and lead. And Cornwall is the only place in the ancient world where you could get tin and lead together. In fact, this identifies Britain as Tarshish, because Tarshish is described as an island that has tin and lead. This is what Coote's History of England says. It says that Bocart, a historian, is of the opinion that the Phoenicians called the island of Britain by the name of Baratani, that is, the land of tin, an appellation which the Greeks softened into Britannia, and whence arose the Roman Britannia. So the very name Britain comes from this tin trade that the Phoenicians had with Britain, and they called the land Tarshish. And so when Ezekiel refers to Britain, he refers to Tarshish. And it's interesting that he describes them as the merchants of Tarshish, because Britain is a great maritime trading power, but also with the young lions thereof. And it's quite interesting how that in World War I we have an enlistment poster depicting Britain as the old empire, the lion, the old lion, with the young lions of the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, Canada. And that's how they've depicted themselves. In fact, the United States would be the foremost of the young lions. While it was a former colony of Britain, it certainly is a great ally. That special relationship between Britain and the United States is like no other between other countries. And there is a special role foretold by the Bible by Tarshish with relation to Israel. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 9 and 10, it says, "Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from afar." So this is talking about Israel. Israel had been scattered throughout the nations by God. And the ships of Tarshish would be the first to bring the sons of Israel back from their dispersion, back into the land of Israel. And in Ezekiel chapter 38, which describes this invasion by this northern confederacy of nations and the opposition to them by Tarshish, it describes the nation of Israel having been gathered back into the land once more. It says in verse 8, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land." This is talking to the northern invader. "That is brought back from the sword, that is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." You see, Israel has not been a people in the land until recent times, about 50 years ago. And so this prophecy is timed in the latter years. The time period of this prophecy is in the latter years. That's a Bible term which talks about the events leading to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ to the earth. And the regathering of Israel as a nation in the land is a great sign of that. Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 12 also describes it this way: "The desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations." You see, this invasion is directed against the nation of Israel that has recently been brought back into its land. That's what's being described here. 2,000 years ago, the Jews were dispersed out of Judea by the Romans. The Jews had rebelled, the Romans came in and scattered them out. They were not allowed to live in that land. There were a few that remained, but very few. And they gave that name, that land, the name of Palestine, which persists till today. But the Bible has always predicted that Israel would be gathered back into that land again. This is what the Lord Jesus Christ said just prior to that dispersion. So this happened in AD 70, just 70 years after the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he said that they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now the word Gentile just simply means a non-Jew. So there's going to come a time, the Lord Jesus Christ says, when the Gentiles will no longer be in control of Jerusalem and of the land of Israel, because the Jews will be brought back. And what is very interesting, and this does have a direct bearing on World War I and Bible prophecy, is that just in the late 1800s, in 1897, just prior really to World War I, we had the birth of the Zionist movement under Theodor Herzl. For 2,000 years, the Jews had tried to assimilate into other societies but failed. They had been persecuted, they had been the subject of pogroms and holocausts. And so there was a Zionist movement to establish Jews, a state of Israel, back in the land once again, the first time ever. And that was no accident, because World War I was going to see the fulfillment of this dream by Theodor Herzl and the Zionists. You see, World War I was the precursor to the time for another great war. And so World War I is certainly not the war that ended all wars. It's actually a war that caused more wars than any other war before it. But this war is going to be the war that ends all wars. What God says in Joel chapter 3 verse 1 and 2 is that when Judah and Jerusalem are restored to Israel again, that's the time when there's going to be a war. So in Ezekiel chapter 38 it's called the latter days or the last days. And that's the time when Israel is regathered. And when that happens, God says in Joel chapter 3 verse 1 and 2, in those days and in that time, in the latter days, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat. And the valley of Jehoshaphat is a valley just beside Jerusalem. And I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, because that's the invasion described in Ezekiel chapter 38 that we've just saw before, involving all the combatants of World War I. And all of those combatants are being shaped by history, and World War I was a significant part of that shaping. So this is the invasion that is spoken of, a world war that will be the end of all wars, which we'll see later on in our next talk. So how did World War I change the world? Well, we've already seen how there were the fall of four major empires. We've seen the rivalry between Russia and Britain and the restoration of Israel as a great nation. And we're going to be looking at the Middle East conflict and the influence that that has on world affairs, and in particular, one prophecy that was directly fulfilled in World War I. So that's the subject for our talk next, our next talk. And today, we do live in an age where there are many echoes of the circumstances of World War I. Not that it's exactly the same, but certainly history is rhyming. We have a dominant United States and Britain, the great maritime power, as there was in World War I. We have the rise of Russian power and a rapid naval expansion, which Germany had before in World War I. We have the continuation of Anglo-US and Russian rivalry. We have two main alliance blocks. We have a newly unified Germany rising in power, and not just a unified Germany, but a whole European Union, of which Germany is the backbone. We have war in the Ukraine, we have trouble in the Balkans, we still have nationalism as a potent force, and we're still witnessing the vacuum of power from the fall of autocratic powers in Europe and the Middle East. In the news today, that is still going on. The reverberations of the fall of the Ottoman Empire are still with us, and the conflicts that are caused as ethnic groups struggle for self-determination. And of course, fueling all of that is a very lucrative arms industry that the great powers are quite willing to make money out of. So that is our first talk, and we'll resume after morning tea, focusing on the Middle East.